The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas various politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, education, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C Brown Jr., and with us today is Herb Boyd, columnist for the New York Amsterdam News. Welcome to African American Legend.
Hey, Doc. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I have so many legends coming in, and you write about these legends.
Indeed. That's part of my profession.
Now, most recently, we saw each other at the inauguration on January 20th of President Barrack Hussein Obama. A pivotal event in American history, pivotal event in African American history.
No doubt.
You were there. What was your reaction?
My goodness. I usually, well, I've been on this campaign trail for some 23 months, almost 2 years, you know, Roscoe, just following around this campaign. I was in Chicago. You work backwards there. I was in Denver, and of course being down in Washington, D.C., where we bumped into each other. It was such a pleasure to see you and all the Tuskegee Airmen down there.
That was really just absolutely exciting.
Well, see, that's part of the excitement for me, is that not so much how I feel, but how other people feel. Because you're always trying to kind of write down.
Well, you're a journalist.
Yeah, right. You know, it ain't about me, it's about you. And just talking to you and Lee Archer and seeing, I guess it was Earl Graves that was also
Earl
there.
Graves was there. That's right.
And took a nice photo of all of you. It hasn't been published yet, but that's part of what my experience is really to record and document other folks' experiences. And I had an opportunity to talk to all kinds of people from all walks of life, as it was in Chicago, as it was in Denver. So I kind of like chart other folks' feelings, but I'm excited too. But I was very excited.
On that mall, 1.5 million people squeezed together, like between you and me, there'd be 3 other people in here. And to see the smiles and the support that the new president got, and I understand they didn't have a single arrest.
Not one.
That is absolutely amazing. You know, people were saying, excuse me, I want to get in, but if they couldn't get in, they'd listen to it. That was a turning point in the attitude of this country. Now, as a journalist, how do you project that? I know you write about it and did a good job of writing about it, but how do you project that in terms of the way you approach the story of this new president?
Well, I think that's a good point, you know, in terms of just what kind of disturbances, what kind of upheavals, what kind of, you know, if there were any kind of bad scenes there, usually how journalism is, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. But there was no blood. There was no blood to follow down there. There was nothing that was any way at all disharmonious. I mean, the kind of courtesy was just exceptional, extraordinary courtesy, as you suggest. But my concern is you're trying to get to the core of the story, you know, what's going on here.
What is the core of the Obama story from your perspective?
I think the core for me is certainly you can't ignore the whole historic aspects of it. Most of the people that I talked to over the months that I was on the campaign trail, you had some mixed feelings. Of course, here in New York, you had a considerable number of people who were Hillary Clinton supporters, and that's pretty obvious why that would be so. But at the same time, others were like believing that this may be a possibility for us. I don't think it really dawned on a lot of African Americans that there was really a chance on this whole thing until possibly Iowa. You know, it began to kind of change it. Well, and then of course the Carolinas came in, particularly South Carolina, and that began to market after New Hampshire, after what had happened with Hillary winning in New Hampshire. A lot of people say, I told you so, but then quickly it reversed. And so it would go for the rest of the campaign. One of the things about it is that the internet, that's where I live a little bit on the internet too, because I run a website called The Black World Today. And I'm in touch with a whole different community of people out there who spend a lot of time online, particularly young people. And I think that after Howard Dean and other people who had looked into the possibility of this new technology and how it could really fortify their particular, and bolster their campaigns, and the utilization of the internet as a tool, and I certainly see it as a tool, and they had the leg up on them, on the others, including McCain, by the time you got to the general election. There was no doubt about it. It was a very decisive edge that he had there.
Now, given that some lower-income black folks don't have computers, how did the internet help to mobilize the vote of the lower-income, working-class black folks?
It's certainly a good point, and good question, too, in terms of the interaction. It certainly has to be interaction between online and offline.
What about the black press?
Well, the black press, you know, what I'm concerned about is that what role it would play as this thing develops. I mean, the first 100 days, you know, the assessment, the analysis we have coming from, generally from the press, is that I think they were willing to give Obama an extended honeymoon here. There's some concerns about the accessibility that the black press may have to the White House. You know, I mean, he has the first, major press conference after the inauguration there. And he had a number of blacks, you know, in the front seats, but they were not called on. He called on two of them, Michael Fletcher and Helene Cooper, who's with the New York Times and the Washington Post, respectively. They had an opportunity to ask questions. So we're concerned about black-owned press. Are we there? Do we have any more access than we had with Bush or Reagan? Or
now, what are the major African-American papers? Back in, you know, the 20s and 30s, there were about 300 African-American papers all over the country. That's the main way in which the African-American community communicated with itself and knew what's going on. That number has dwindled considerably.
Oh my goodness.
What are the main African-American journals throughout the country now, beginning with the Amsterdam News?
Well, Amsterdam News, of course, is the largest and the oldest. You have the Philadelphia, you got the Philadelphia paper, you've got the Atlanta World, you've got the Chicago Defender is still out there.
There's the Pittsburgh Courier.
Oh, yeah, the Pittsburgh. I think the Final Call begins to fill a gap, which I like to see.
That's the Nation's paper.
In terms of like the Nation of Islam. That's the closest I think we have to a national
black publication. Associated Negro Press.
The NNPA, yeah, the NNPA, the National Publishers Association, and certainly it's out there, and it's a what do you call it, a consortium. It's a consortium. All of these different black presses coming together.
And you get articles that are written by one person and go into 5 or 6 other papers.
They share them, and much to the chagrin of a number of writers, because we don't get paid for it. You know, once you're part of a consortium, you're sharing, you know, different stories and articles, and consequently, before I could write a similar story for Final Call and get a separate pay for that, and do a story for maybe Amsterdam News or some other publication and get paid separately from it. Now, all of them are a part of a consortium. You only get paid once. It's like a painter, you know, once you sell that painting, that's it, it's gone,
well,
the owner has it.
Again, with the fact that there's a limited number of papers in the African-American community, many of the African community depend on their local dailies and the Associated Press, many of which have black writers now. Now, to what extent does that change the way in which the story is communicated?
To some degree, you know, writers have some independence, may be in a position to follow or initiate or launch some investigation on a story that an editor won't assign. I've had experience working with the major dailies, and I know that all of that happens in what you call a city room. And editors put their heads together and this is a story, and then they assign their reporters to go out and do it. Rarely do reporters come in and say, I've got this story, and they'll say, okay, throw it in the pile there with the rest of them. Now, having a black journalist at some of these major dailies, they too are at the whim and caprice, you know, of City Room or the national desk. And they just have to wait and hope that they can get an assignment. Like today's New York Times, for example, there's a headline story written by Helene Cooper. And she's a black reporter, but she's writing about the troop enhancement, the number of troops that are going to be sent into Afghanistan. So you figure that What's your position on that, Helene? You know, well, her position doesn't count at all. She got a report. Here's what President Obama is going to send. You know, 50% already got some 30,000, 35,000 troops in Afghanistan. Here comes another, you know, 17, 18,000 more being pumped in there. So a lot of people have positions against that war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So she, as a reporter, she's like, you know, chained to a certain so-called objectivity where you have to deal with that situation. Your own feelings can't come in there. But the best reporters find kind of ways to write between the lines and have some kind of editorial slant on it, you know.
Well, as you have reviewed some of the African-American press since Obama has been inaugurated, what kind of response do you think he's getting?
It's getting a very good, first of all, I mean, you have now a story that's absolutely significant, and they can't avoid it. So you have to have some kind of angle and perspective on it. And usually, the majority of them, like I say, are going to give him an extended honeymoon. It's kind of treat him with kids' gloves. They're going to handle him very gently and give him a chance to really work this here first term through. And maybe it'll start to change as certain other issues pop up there where they'll be compelled by their advertising to move in another direction on it. But for the most part, I think the black press will be supportive. It has been. I don't see any reason why they'll abandon him, although many of them raised problems during the campaign. Roscoe is like, how much money did he spend with us? How many ads did he take out in our magazines and newspapers, and little or nothing?
Well, that's an interesting point, because when you try to be a mainstream candidate and you have your base, the question is, how far do you move away from your base? How much do you involve your base? Obama has done a fairly good job of balancing that, but in some instances, even today, some of the more progressive blacks and whites saying you're not doing enough in the stimulus bill, you're not involving enough of us in making these decisions.
Indeed.
Have you ever, I know you have, but in your conversation with Obama, how did you feel about his way of communicating?
Well, I don't know if I may have been a bit too intimidating for him. You know, here I'm showing up with my kufi and my sunglasses. Wait a minute now, where's this coming? I don't have
you're from New York. We're accustomed to that.
no photo op with this guy. Next thing you know, the whole Islam and whatever.
Well, that's true.
That's true. But he did field a couple of questions from me. I've been with him in at least 4 press conferences, and I was never able to get a question during the press conferences, but I had a one-on-one with him on one occasion, thanks to the Tatums, again, at the Amsterdam News. I had a chance to ask him a couple of things, and for the most part, he was very forthcoming, although at that time, Roscoe, he's just getting his campaign in motion when I saw him. Later on at the Apollo Theater, I had a chance to kind of brush up against him just for a moment there, but not a chance to really interview him. As you suggest, he's a moderate. He's a very pragmatic centrist, and he's not going to deviate too far off course. And you see that when I first heard him, maybe before even Iowa, check out 2004 at the Fleet Center in Boston when he delivered that address. I think that's when he
got
jumped out on the national platform, and I think they saw, the powers that be saw that, he may be the one we need.
There's no such thing as a red state, no such thing as a blue state. Now, we know that's not true.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But he pulled that together, which was that was a brilliant
doubt about it.
Because it showed that unlike previous African-American candidates who were mobilizing the black community and says, come with us, he was saying, we're part of you, you're part of us. And that was a stroke of genius.
Well, Roscoe, he could not at all play the race card. Otherwise, it would have been too polarizing. He couldn't do that. He had a team around him who had done a thorough job of looking at the political landscape and how exactly to move this campaign forward with the possibility of victory.
It's a 21st century campaign.
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, some realities, some social and political economic realities out there that, we're going to have to deal with. I think in Philadelphia in March, behind Reverend Jeremiah Wright, he had to that's what you call a real bump in the road.
Yeah.
And he jumped on that in a very eloquent and magnificent way to dispel any possibility of losing that base, you know, because the base was shaking, you know, where you guys, we don't know this guy. And suddenly you have all of the explosion of Reverend Wright and the rhetoric there, which of course he quickly put in, I think, proper historical and political context, you know. But nonetheless, I think that was a good job. And the next time he had to, I mean, he's had these issues along the way to suggest that he is not the progressive that the progressive wanted, nor is he the reactionary out there that many others perceive. He's fell right into the middle there. The cabinet reflects that. I mean, his bipartisanship, reaching across the aisle, trying to bring those folks in, which I think is absolutely futile.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
There's nothing, there's no historical precedent for that. You know, I mean, other presidents have tried the same thing to no avail. So you can forget about bipartisanship. That's out of the way now. So now maybe, but there's certain economic issues out there, and I think the stimulus package, where I'm most concerned, is how does it trickle down to, and that's what my readers want to know. How does that impact our lives, and how fast?
Now, focusing on New York City in this new millennium, we have had a black mayor, David Dinkins.
Sure.
And we have Billy Thompson, who's going to run for mayor, and others who are in the leadership of the city. As you see New York City, particularly Harlem, how do you evaluate the changes that have occurred in the past 15 or 20 years?
I have been living in Harlem now for 25 years, and some of the change is absolutely dramatic and sometimes drastic too. What we're going through and experiencing now is what you call the age, not only age of Obama, but what's happening with gentrification in Harlem. And that continues to be a very troubling issue. I think we're hoping, and certainly many of the small businesses, which I've watched disappear almost on a weekly basis, hear about another disaster in our community in terms of a small business not able to survive. So I guess many of them are probably looking at this stimulus package and to what extent some of that money will trickle down to begin to help them.
Now, why aren't
why
aren't those businesses able to survive?
I think one of the things is it's a combination of what you call inside-outside. On the outside, they're troubled by the advance of retail giants. There's no doubt about that. It's inevitable.
But do the retail giants bring more competitive prices?
I mean, they have larger inventories, so they can undersell you every time. And so you have to have a specialty shop, something that maybe the major stores do not carry, and maybe you can survive to some extent there. But you can't have a specialty shop that is not in tune with the times. And so many of them are like thrown back to the whole nationalistic spirit. And then African American or black nationalism is not as lucrative as it used to be. And I think Obama has spurred it to some extent because you do have a black president there, so a certain kind of marketing thing can develop, as I've seen on 125th Street, and the kind of entrepreneurial zeal, the enthusiasm of these vendors out there. Table after table after table with every conceivable memorabilia of Obama. You know? So, Doc, he's already impacted the economy to a certain extent because, of course, if McCain had won, it wouldn't mean anything to them, you know? But with Obama there, they got their buttons, their scarves, their calendars, their posters, you name it. And so that's helped them quite a bit. But beyond that, you know, you want to have some other kind of things happening. Now, these are just street vendors. What about people who have to go in and pay the exorbitant price per square foot that exists on 120, in what you call the platinum zone?
And that's because Harlem is now considered to be a more upscale community, more discretionary income, more people who you walk up and down 125th Street today and look at it 30 years ago, it's like literally night and day.
Oh, exactly. And so much, it's like a mixed reviews you get on this. You know, some people feel that with the advance of gentrification, there's certain kind of rewards and benefits that we receive, while on the other hand, you have the issue of displacement and the whole housing, critical housing shortage, affordable housing. And so people have those concerns. And I mean, people who are concerned about having their services delivered, they kind of applaud. I mean, suddenly your streets are being cleaned, and the potholes are fixed, and the stop lines are erected, and the lights are being put up here. Certain kind of services, the post office line is not as long. There's now a pharmacy nearby. You can get those things. So they applaud this, particularly for our elderly who don't have the kind of accessibility to move around. So those things being brought to them on a quality basis, they applaud that, and I can understand it. I certainly do too. But at the same time, we have to be, it's kind of a dialectic you have to apply to most social and political issues. There's a good and there's a bad. And which are our ways, and how do you begin to bring those things together to some extent where there's not this polarity between the benefits we could receive and the
facts are that the old Harlem of the 20s and 30s is different from the Harlem of the 50s and 60s, which is different from the Harlem of the 90s and the 21st century.
Yes.
And as you recall, along 8th Avenue, practically every lot was unoccupied buildings. Now they have buildings, some of them affordable, some not affordable, because of a housing initiative.
Yes.
So one of the issues I'm sure you deal with when you write is how do you put progress in perspective?
Oh, yes.
What is progress?
Yeah, right.
You have written about Harlem, you've written about some of the icons in Harlem.
Sure.
But the icons that you really write about were the icons in the heyday of Harlem.
Exactly.
In the 20s and 30s and 40s, when everybody lived there at various economic levels.
And that's what I teach too. In my books, my articles, the teaching that I do, the activism that propels me into all of these activities is based on what you have Sankofa. I have a Sankofa perspective. That is, the Sankofa bird, of course, is the bird that faces forward but looks backwards. And I always have that kind of concern when I go into issues. Certainly the icons and our hero and heroines of the past should not be forgotten. We have to find a way to show, and I think the intergenerational dialogue is important in this context, you know, because the younger people that I talk to, for example, I was giving a lecture not too long ago, and I started talking about Frederick Douglass, and one of my students wanted to know if I knew him personally.
Very good. In 1862.
Was I at the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Very good.
And I thought that was so cute. I had to laugh and explain to him, well, not exactly.
Not exactly.
You know, but then that's important. You know, they raise a question, then you begin to talk about a little bit more in detail who these individuals are, so they don't forget them, because past is prologue. Past is prologue. You have to go back and understand where we have come from, you know, where we come from to be where we are today. So it's just a quick glance back. You don't want to spend maybe too much time. How far back you want to go? You want to take Egypt?
For example, Percy Sutton, the founder of Inner City Broadcasting Company, the savior of the Apollo, was really a major force in the change in Harlem.
Oh, indeed.
Opening the Apollo and keeping it open up 125th Street. I feel that many people don't understand and appreciate the role that Percy Sutton played.
Not at all. Not at all.
Now, why is that?
He's my particular hero, and he knows that, and his family, and I've just idolized him over the years. And he continues to be someone that is trying to do some things out there. You know, he has a legacy of just profound, deep legacy that all of the, not only Harlemites, but the rest of this country ought to understand, because what he did was to create, I think, a model, a kind of an urban model that could be used for a number of cities to develop themselves. You know, for example, getting the Apollo was pretty much the seed to the whole this regeneration, you know, of the Harlem community. Some people look at that from a negative standpoint, but I see it in a positive sense, because it ramifies in such a way, is because if you can begin to develop a radio system, the inner city broadcasting, if you can have the theater thing going, and as a kind of a offspring from that, it begins to touch a number of other very tangible areas in the community. The education thing, for example, how is that improved by making your cultural institutions are improved, so you can have like more young people coming in there and seeing that as a very productive kind of avenue for them to pursue. So I think as a real pace setter and a pioneer, there's no doubt about it, Percy still, you know, remains one of the the Gang of Four, when you talk about the Gang of Four, you know, what they have done, and a number of people,
Dinkins,
their families too.
Rangel, Patterson.
And David Dinkins, yes.
And Sutton.
Exactly.
Now, how does Herb Boyd fit into this? I call you the Bard of Harlem.
Yeah, right.
How do you fit into this?
Well, I'm what you call an author, an activist, a teacher, and a journalist. And people say, well, you can't do all those things. Well, I say, well, what you have to do is understand that there's a certain kind of recycling of information that binds all of these activities of mine. I see myself as a documentarian. I see myself as a historian. I'm concerned about the preservation, you know, of our community, and certainly the elevation and the enlightenment and the raised consciousness of our people, our young people. And how do you bring the griots? It's not to say every old person is a griot. That's not true. And not that every young person is like, you know, radical and progressive ideas.
For the audience, what is a griot?
A griot is like a teacher
from
it's out of the African tradition, as someone has the responsibility of being the keeper of the books,
right,
the keeper of the people's history.
So Herb Boyd is a griot?
I think so. I'm trying to get to that status where Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Ben, you know, those are kind of the resident, well, their ideas, you know, germinate in such a way as that they have been respected, highly respected beyond Harlem, and become national or international griots. So that's one of my aspirations, one of my dreams, and I keep plugging away at that in terms of writing the books and telling other folks' stories. That's one of the things I chiefly am concerned. I've just finished a book with Simeon Wright, who was the first cousin of Emmett Till. That book will be coming out later this year. You know, Yusef Lateef, James Baldwin, tell these people's stories, you know.
Well, on today's African American Legends, we've been talking with griot Herb Boyd, journalist, columnist with the New York Amsterdam News, looking at what this new millennium means for the African American community and how it can be communicated not only to African Americans but to the rest of the world. Thanks for being with us today, Herb.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Okay. Thank you, Doc. Okay.